I want you to try a quick mental experiment for me.
Okay.
Imagine being placed inside a completely empty room. Like, no windows, no art on the walls, and absolute soundproofing so you can't hear a single thing from the outside world.
So just total isolation.
Exactly. No phone in your pocket,
Mm.
nothing to read, just you, total silence, and an absolute lack of anything to engage with.
That sounds peaceful for about 5 minutes.
Right. For the first 5, maybe 10 minutes, it might actually feel like a relief, like a forced break from all the noise. But what happens after an hour? Or, what happens after an entire day?
The human mind really can't handle that.
No, it can't. The profound psychological reality is that human beings absolutely despise emptiness. We are terrified of silence, of isolation, of the void. Most of us find that kind of complete lack of stimulation to be profoundly intolerable.
It's actually a fundamental vulnerability in our hardwiring. I mean, we are creatures built for interaction and friction. We constantly seek out something to push against, even if that something is conflict. When you deny a human being that friction, when you force them to face a true void, the mind doesn't just rest. It begins to turn on itself.
Oh, absolutely.
It hallucinates threats, it breeds paranoia, and, well, it eventually breaks down entirely.
And that breakdown is exactly what we're exploring today on this deep dive. Because, while we think of nothingness as harmless, it is actually one of the most devastating weapons ever devised.
It really is.
Today, we're working from a fascinating document titled 26 Deny Them Targets.pdf, and our mission is to unpack what we're calling the strategy of the void. We're going to explore how giving an opponent absolutely nothing to hit, becoming entirely elusive, right, like dangerous but vaporous, is the ultimate shortcut to shattering their mind and exhausting their resources.
And this isn't just an abstract theory or some niche military history lesson. This is a profound psychological manipulation.
Yeah, a shadow logic.
Exactly. We're going to track how this shadow logic works, starting with the biggest military blunder in history. But then we're going to show you how these exact dynamics play out in corporate boardrooms, in bureaucratic offices, and even in modern romance.
I can't wait to get to the romance part.
Yeah.
But to really grasp the abstract concept of the void, we first have to watch the greatest military genius of the 19th century completely unraveled because of it.
Right. We need to look at 1812.
Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yes. This is the year Napoleon launched his invasion of Russia, which remains arguably the most catastrophic military blunder in recorded history.
But he didn't just wake up one day and decide to march to Moscow, right?
No, not at all. To understand why it failed, we have to understand the dynamic between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia. A few years prior, they had signed this massive treaty of alliance.
Okay.
But geopolitics shifted. Russia felt the treaty gave France way too much influence in Poland, which was basically Russia's front yard.
Makes sense.
So Tsar Alexander starts subtly pushing back. He repudiates parts of the agreement. He starts taking these diplomatic actions he knows will just infuriate Napoleon.
Wait, hold on. If you're the Tsar of Russia, why are you deliberately poking the most aggressive military commander on the planet?
It does seem crazy.
Right. I mean, it seems suicidal. Napoleon had conquered practically everything he touched at that point.
Well, it seems suicidal if you view conflict purely in terms of physical force. But Alexander understood something much deeper about Napoleon's psychology.
Okay, what was that?
When Napoleon felt insulted or challenged, his instinct was overwhelming retaliation. He couldn't help himself. So he decided it was time to teach Russia a permanent lesson. He was going to march east, acquire this vast territory, and effectively make himself the ruler of the largest empire in human history.
I still have a hard time wrapping my head around the sheer scale of this invasion. Like, how big of a force are we talking about here?
The mobilization was totally unprecedented. Napoleon assembled an army of roughly 650,000 men.
650,000.
Yeah. 450,000 of those formed the main attack force, while the rest were dedicated to securing, lines of communication and supply across the continent.
That's just a staggering amount of human beings to move across Europe in the 1800s.
To put that in perspective, this was 3 times larger than any army he had ever led into battle. He was bringing the greatest hammer the world had ever seen, assuming he could just dominate the enormous spaces of Russia through sheer, overwhelming firepower.
But I do want to push back a little on the idea that Napoleon was just acting like a blind megalomaniac here.
Oh, he wasn't blind.
Right. When you look at the preparations he made, he wasn't just recklessly throwing men at the problem. He actually approached this with the meticulousness of, like, a type A student over-preparing for a final exam.
He really did do his homework.
Yeah, he explicitly studied the failed invasion of Russia by the King of Sweden from a century earlier.
He did. He anticipated almost every conventional obstacle. I mean, he knew the Russian roads were notoriously terrible. He knew the local food supplies were meager at best, and that the climate swung between these brutal extremes. He even anticipated that the Russians might use a scorched earth policy, destroying their own resources to starve him out.
So his logistical planning was borderline obsessive. He calculated that normal supply lines stretching all the way back to Europe would just snap under the distance. So he built vast storehouses near the Russian border, just filled with wheat and rice.
And he had to account for the animals, too.
Exactly. He realized he couldn't possibly carry enough fodder for the 150,000 horses his army required. So what does he do? He deliberately delays the invasion until June.
Which is pretty late for a military campaign in that region.
Right, but he gambled that the Russian plains would finally be green enough for his horses to graze on summer grass. He even added materials to build flour mills to his packing list because he found out Russia lacked the infrastructure to grind their own grain. Like, he genuinely thought of everything.
And because of that intense preparation, he was supremely confident. He told his ministers he foresaw complete victory within 3 weeks.
3 weeks?
Yeah, he thought there'd be a massive decisive clash, a quick Russian surrender, and he'd be back in Paris before fall.
But then reality hit.
Exactly. When this vast armada crossed the border in June 1812, all of that preparation met the reality of the void.
So what did the Russians actually do when the French showed up?
Nothing.
Nothing at all.
Well, they enacted a strategy of nothingness. The two main Russian armies stationed in Lithuania simply retreated. They moved incredibly fast, slipping away before Napoleon could pin them down.
Wow.
He brought this world-shattering hammer, and the Russians just refused to provide the anvil.
That has to be so infuriating. You gear up 500,000 men for the fight of their lives, and the enemy just evaporates into thin air.
And it wasn't just a physical retreat. They took the scorched earth concept to a level Napoleon couldn't have even fathomed.
What do you mean?
As the Russian army fell back, the peasants burned their own crops. They destroyed all the food storehouses. The French were relying on foraging to supplement their supplies, right? But the locals refused to sell food at any price.
That's intense.
There are accounts of peasants literally setting fire to their own hay rather than letting a single French horse take a bite.
Which is where we see the environment itself being weaponized by the void. Unmanageable difficulties began to pile up almost instantly for Napoleon.
Exactly. Heavy summer rains followed by intense heat turned those already terrible Russian roads into bottomless mud traps. The army's pace slowed to an absolute crawl.
And those 150,000 horses, Napoleon waited until June to feed.
This is the part that just blew my mind when we were reading the source material. The whole summer grass strategy completely backfired.
Utterly backfired. The summer grass was rank and unhealthy. Within days, the horses began dropping dead by the thousand.
It's horrific.
And when the soldiers tried to find alternatives, they resorted to tearing the thatch off the roofs of peasant houses to feed the animals. But in doing so, they compromised the structures, and the roofs would collapse, literally crushing the horses underneath.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Over 10,000 horses died in the opening days of the campaign, which instantly triggers a catastrophic domino effect. Because if the horses die, the artillery can't move.
Right.
The supply wagons get stuck in the mud. And if the wagons can't reach the front, the soldiers don't eat.
And a starving army drinking contaminated water is an army waiting for disease. Dysentery swept through the French ranks with terrifying speed.
I think the numbers on this are staggering.
They are. At the height of this outbreak, 900 men were dying every single day.
Well, let's just pause and visualize that. 900 men every single day.
Yes.
And they haven't fought a single battle yet. They're just walking into an empty landscape and dying.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the void. Napoleon is bleeding manpower at a rate that would normally signify a brutal, prolonged battle, yet his enemy is invisible.
So what does he do? Does he turn around?
No, to try and force an engagement, he pushes deeper and deeper east. Every time his vanguard gets tantalizingly close to the Russian rearguard, his own exhausted, starving men just can't move fast enough to close the net.
He just slip away again.
Exactly. June bleeds into July. The Russians unite their forces at Smolensk, which is over 200 miles further east than Napoleon ever intended to go.
And this is where the psychological torture really sets in. You have this massive, disciplined force. They are suffering, they are sick, and they are desperate for the release of a glorious battle.
Right, they want to fight.
But instead of a battle, they're subjected to what can only be described as maddening pinprick attacks.
The Cossacks.
Right.
These were small bands of highly mobile Russian cavalry that operated totally independently of the main army. They executed constant, unpredictable hit-and-run raids.
But honestly, how much damage can a few guys on horseback really do to an army of hundreds of thousands?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds annoying, sure, but not strategically devastating.
It's not about the physical damage at that stage. It's about the psychological friction.
Okay, unpack that.
The constant threat of a raid, the inability to ever truly rest, the hypervigilance required. It exercised a baleful influence far in excess of the actual military danger. It basically gave the entire French army a collective, paralyzing case of the jitters.
Okay, that makes total sense. There's this vivid anecdote from the document about this regarding some Hessian troops stationed at a town called Vitebsk.
Yes, Captain Roeder's diary.
Right, so this captain, Roeder, he kept a diary, and he describes the garrison mustering for a formal, highly disciplined parade right outside the emperor's quarters. Everyone is standing at attention.
Very orthodox military behavior.
Exactly. And suddenly, this absolute chaotic panic ripples through the entire force. Soldiers are breaking ranks, shouting, grabbing their weapons. And why? Because a rumor spread that a few Cossacks had been spotted on the horizon and might have carried off a single French forager.
And when the garrison finally scrambles their cavalry and rides out to meet this supposedly massive threat,
What do they find?
they find maybe 24 Cossacks just dodging around, completely unbothered.
It's comical.
Captain Roeder actually writes in his diary that if the Cossacks keep this up, they will be able to send the entire garrison to the hospital in 14 days without losing a single man.
It's psychological warfare in its purest form. The French are swinging wildly at shadows, exhausting themselves. So Napoleon finally decides he has to end this chase. He pushes his deteriorating army to Smolensk, convinced the Russians will stand and fight because, it's a holy city.
Right.
He arrives in mid-August. His main force of 450,000 is already down to 150,000.
A massive loss.
And what do the Russians do? They fight a brief holding action and then retreat again, leaving Smolensk a burning, ruined husk. No food, no shelter, no victory.
At this point, Napoleon is entirely baffled. He simply cannot comprehend the Russian mindset.
It makes no sense to him.
To a conventional commander, they appeared suicidal, willing to burn their own civilization to the ground rather than surrender it. He faces a critical juncture here. Halt in the ruins of Smolensk to survive the coming winter, or push on toward Moscow.
And his ego takes the wheel.
It does.
He rationalizes that Tsar Alexander must defend Moscow. I mean, it's the heart of the empire.
Right.
If Moscow falls, the war is over. So he whips his starving troops further east. Finally, in early September, just 75 miles from Moscow, the Russians turn and make a stand at the village of Borodino.
And it is an absolute meat grinder.
Okay.
Because of the massive loss of horses earlier, Napoleon lacks the cavalry needed for his signature flanking maneuvers.
Right, it can't be clever.
Exactly. He is forced to resort to a blunt, head-on frontal assault. The casualties on both sides are just astronomical.
Yeah.
But eventually, the Russians do what they always do. They retreat in good order.
Leaving the road to Moscow open.
Yes.
So a week later, Napoleon's army now reduced to a staggering 100,000 men out of the original 450,000 straggles into Moscow. And Napoleon is ecstatic. One of his marshals literally wrote a letter home saying the emperor believed the world was about to change.
He expects the classic conclusion to a conquest.
Yeah, he's waiting for the city dignitaries to march out and hand him the keys to Moscow on a velvet cushion, just like they did in Vienna and Berlin.
But instead, he steps right into the ultimate void. He finds an empty prize, the citizens have fled, the markets are completely bare, and almost immediately, small fires break out across the city.
And they grow.
They quickly merge into a terrible inferno that burns for 5 days.
Because the Russians didn't just leave, did they? They engaged in an act of spectacular, spiteful sabotage. They removed all the water pumps from the city before they evacuated.
So they ensured it would burn.
Right. So Napoleon is literally sitting in the burning, empty ashes of his greatest conquest. He starts sending letters to the Tsar, offering generous peace terms, essentially begging for the war to formally end. And the Russians.
They just stall, they pretend to negotiate, they offer vague promises, and weeks drag on.
They're just playing with him.
They are simply running out the clock. They are waiting for their greatest ally, which is the Russian winter. Finally, in mid-October, the reality pierces Napoleon's denial. He realizes he is completely trapped without supplies. He orders the retreat back towards Smolensk, and this is when the true horror really begins.
those undisciplined bands of Cossacks. They've now organized into larger guerrilla forces of about 500 men, and as the French trudge back through the devastation they caused on the way in, the Cossacks slaughter the stragglers relentlessly.
It was a nightmare.
The French soldiers can't sleep. Thousands simply lay down in the mud and die of fatigue. And then the snow begins to fall.
The temperature just plummets. The few remaining horses freeze to death. The soldiers, who are still dressed in tattered summer uniforms, are forced to march past the battlefield of Borodino.
Which is still covered in bodies.
Yes, tens of thousands of unburied French corpses, many being pulled apart by wolves. It is a scene of apocalyptic psychological destruction. By the time the remnants of the army reach Smolensk, barely 40,000 men are left.
It gets worse. In early December, after a desperate crossing of the Berezina River, Napoleon receives word of a political plot against him back in France. So what does he do? He abandons his freezing troops and flees for Paris in a carriage,
leaving them behind.
Out of the 450,000 men in his main attack force, only about 25,000 make it back alive. Napoleon miraculously escaped with his own life, but he never truly recouped his losses. The void of Russia was the grave of his empire.
Which forces us to ask the foundational question of this entire analysis. How does a genius of Napoleon's caliber let his entire army get swallowed by snow, disease, and starvation?
Right.
I mean, he wasn't outmaneuvered in a grand tactical sense. He wasn't caught in a giant pincer movement.
He didn't lose a glorious battle.
Precisely. He lost because his physical army collapsed only after his mind had already been completely conquered by the void.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that mental collapse. We really need to look at this through the eyes of Tsar Alexander.
Tsar Alexander had compiled a very acute psychological profile of Napoleon. They had met several times before the war, right?
Yep.
Alexander understood that Napoleon was profoundly aggressive. His genius required a canvas, and that canvas was the battlefield. He needed contact with the enemy to process information, to find weaknesses, and frankly, to exercise his dominance.
So Alexander realizes that engaging Napoleon in a massive battle is exactly what Napoleon's brain wants. It provides the feedback loop he thrives on.
Exactly.
By deliberately refusing that contact, by retreating into the vastness, Alexander lured him into a void. Empty lands, empty cities, empty time.
Alexander knew that denying a highly aggressive personality contact would trigger a cascade of negative emotions. Severe irritation, then anger, and ultimately a paralyzing confusion.
The waiting drove him mad.
Napoleon's internal monologue became totally warped. The lack of friction eroded his objectivity. He kept thinking, just one more march, just one solid battle, and I can crush them. His emotional desperation to fill the void completely overwhelmed his strategic brilliance.
Which perfectly explains the delusion in Moscow. I mean, why else would a military genius sit in a burning, foodless city in October, knowing winter is coming, hoping for a surrender from an enemy whose army is completely intact?
He was broken.
His mind was broken by the waiting. And it wasn't just him, the entire army suffered from it. There is a profound observation in our sources. A soldier is capable of enduring almost any physical hardship, cold, hunger, endless marching. But the one thing they cannot endure is the expectation of a battle that never comes.
That tension.
Right. The psychological tension that is never relieved destroys discipline from the inside out.
And we can connect this dynamic to a much broader truth about human nature.
Which is?
We simply cannot endure a void. We hate long stretches of inactivity. We hate loneliness. There's a psychological theory that this deep-seated intolerance for emptiness is actually linked to our ultimate existential fear.
The fear of death.
Yes. The fear of death, which is the final void. We have a biological compulsion to fill empty space with action, noise, or conflict.
And when an opponent weaponizes that compulsion, when they deliberately give you absolutely nothing to hit, they are playing on your deepest psychological frailty.
They're using your own brain against you.
The absence of interaction infuriates the conventional mind. It makes you abandon logic and chase madly after a ghost. Which brings me to this incredible analogy that perfectly encapsulates the physics of this strategy. Think about a mosquito.
Ah, yes. It is the perfect distillation of the dynamic.
Imagine you're lying in bed trying to sleep, and you hear that high-pitched, irritating whir in your ear.
The worst sound.
You know it's there. You slap your own neck, you punch the pillow, you swat at the dark. But you can't punch a mosquito. Mechanically speaking, it has no front line to attack. It has no flanks. It has no supply chain you can disrupt.
No.
It is just a tiny vaporous presence that constantly evades your physical strength. Meanwhile, look at you. You are this massive, slow-moving giant offering endless acreage of exposed flesh, To the mosquito, you are just an infinite, juicy buffet of targets.
And the deeper realization comes when you analyze how that conflict inevitably ends. Well, you cannot beat the mosquito with brute force. Eventually, you realize the only effective solution is to surrender the space. You have to stop fighting, get up, and leave the room.
You have to walk away.
Exactly. This illustrates exactly why the strategy of the void is so devastatingly effective against an oversized opponent. Their sheer size, their massive wealth, their complex infrastructure, these aren't advantages. They are liabilities. The larger the enemy, the more they struggle to maneuver, and the more juicy targets they present to the smaller, vaporous force.
It totally flips the script. We are conditioned from birth to believe that bigger is better. More resources, more money, more manpower equals victory.
Normally, yeah.
But in this specific type of conflict, all that size is just more surface area to get bitten.
And this realization isn't just an abstract theory. Over thousands of years, as smaller tribes and nations were repeatedly attacked by massive conventional empires, this dynamic was studied and refined.
It became a whole system.
Yes, it eventually coalesced into an entirely separate shadow rulebook for warfare.
I really want to explore the difference between those two rulebooks. How does the conventional logic of conflict differ from this shadow logic?
The orthodox logic of war is practically universal. It operates on a very linear, positive formula. The goal is to gather a massive, concentrated army. You move that army into a very limited, clearly defined theater of war.
Like a specific battlefield.
Right. Your entire objective is to force a decisive, spectacular battle. You want to surprise the enemy, hit them with overwhelming force, and end the war as quickly as possible before your own resources and public morale begin to deteriorate.
Right. You secure your supply lines, you form a solid front, you protect your rear, and you try to deliver a knockout punch. It is deeply logical, and it relies on physical mass.
But every human system generates a shadow. This shadow logic, what we now call guerrilla logic, originated out of pure necessity. When smaller nations faced a massive invader, they realized that any attempt to follow the orthodox rulebook and fight a direct battle would result in their immediate annihilation.
They couldn't win a fair fight.
Exactly. So they did the only thing they could do. They fled. And in fleeing, they discovered that the longer they eluded the enemy, the more the enemy's orthodox strategies began to collapse under their own weight.
The shadow rulebook is essentially a photographic negative of conventional warfare.
That's a great way to put it.
Where the orthodox rulebook says, concentrate your forces, the shadow rulebook says, disperse into small, fluid bands. Where the orthodox rulebook says, protect your front and rear, the shadow logic says, never form a front line to begin with.
You can't attack what isn't there.
Instead of fighting in a limited theater, you expand the battlefield as widely as possible. You melt into the countryside, into the mountains, forcing the giant enemy to stretch themselves incredibly thin trying to find you.
And most crucially, the shadow logic inverts the concept of time.
Oh, this is fascinating.
The orthodox commander wants a quick victory, but the guerrilla fighter makes time their primary offensive weapon. They deliberately drag the conflict out over years, causing maximum friction, draining the enemy's treasury, and slowly bleeding their morale dry.
It's fascinating that the term guerrilla literally translates to small war in Spanish.
Yes, from the Peninsular War.
Right. In the early 1800s, when Napoleon invaded Spain, instead of facing the French army on an open field, the Spanish fighters melted into the rugged terrain and unleashed absolute hell on the French forces.
There is a striking historical account from a French officer, J.F.A. Lemire de Corvée, written in 1823. He analyzes the mechanics of this Spanish resistance.
What did he observe?
He notes there were perhaps 150 to 200 of these guerrilla bands scattered across the entire country. They flatly refused to fight pitched battles. Their entire operational model was attacking the vulnerable seams of the French war machine.
The supply lines, mostly.
Exactly. They shot stragglers, they intercepted couriers, they ambushed supply convoys in narrow mountain passes.
And the cumulative effect of those pinpricks is mind-blowing. De Corvée estimated that these tiny bands, sometimes consisting of just 30 or 40 guys, managed to kill roughly 80,000 Frenchmen a year.
80,000?
80,000. Without a single glorious battle. He uses this brilliant metaphor. He likens their strategy to a drop of water endlessly dripping onto a massive stone. One drop does nothing. But over time, the stone is inevitably carved away.
We see the exact same philosophy articulated a century later by T.E. Lawrence.
Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes, during the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. In the Seven Pillars of Wisdom, he refers to his strategy as a war of detachment. His explicit goal was never to make physical contact with the Turkish forces.
So how do you fight if you don't make contact?
He wanted to contain them using the psychological weight of the environment. He described it as wielding the silent threat of a vast unknown desert. He actually wrote about cultivating an unconscious habit of never engaging the enemy, perfecting the art of denying them a target while keeping them trapped in a state of constant, exhausting hypervigilance.
But, if we stop here, we're just telling cool history stories about horses and muskets in deserts.
Right, it goes deeper than that.
The true genius of this shadow logic is that because its foundation is psychological manipulation, it isn't confined to physical violence. The strategy of the void works flawlessly in the modern world. It works in the boardroom, it works in politics, and it even works in personal relationships.
So how do you apply guerrilla warfare to a space where you can't use physical weapons?
Let's look at Wall Street. In the late 1860s, there was a vicious corporate conflict known as the Erie Railroad War. The two main combatants perfectly embodied the two rulebooks we just discussed. On one side, you have Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore.
The giant.
Exactly. He is the orthodox, tight and aggressive, oversized, commanding immense wealth, and used to crushing his opponents with direct frontal assaults.
And on the other side, you have Jay Gould, a shrewd financial operator who instinctively understood how to play the mosquito.
Vanderbilt decides he wants to take over the Erie Railroad. He uses his vast resources to buy up stock, launching a massive conventional takeover bid. But Gould doesn't meet him in the open market.
That would be playing Vanderbilt's game.
He doesn't try to outspend Vanderbilt because he'd lose. Instead, he operates entirely in the shadows. Gould quietly goes to the New York State legislature and uses back channels to push through legal loopholes that specifically undermine Vanderbilt's hostile takeover.
Vanderbilt's aggressive instincts flare up, of course. He wants to crush Gould. He prepares to deploy his legal and financial artillery. But by the time Vanderbilt actually swings his massive weight around, Gould is completely gone.
He vanished.
He has already shifted his operations, moved to a different state jurisdiction, or found a new loophole. Gould deliberately agitated the giant, triggered his anger, and then left him swinging at thin air.
And Gould's use of the media was brilliant financial guerrilla warfare. He operated as a smokescreen. Gould would plant these anonymous, sensational articles in the newspapers, painting Vanderbilt as this evil, greedy, monopolistic tyrant trying to ruin the American economy,
creating a massive distraction.
Suddenly, Vanderbilt is completely distracted. He's wasting all his time, energy, and capital defending his public reputation, trying to fight a PR war on multiple fronts, while Gould remains utterly invisible, pulling the strings from the darkness.
What's mechanically brilliant about Gould's approach is how he funds this campaign. In a conventional war, supplying your army is a massive logistical burden, but in the Shadow Rulebook, there is a core tenet. You must supply your insurgency using your enemy's resources.
Yes, financial judo.
Exactly.
Gould actually started his campaign by infiltrating Vanderbilt's own inner circle. He positioned himself as a partner, gained access to Vanderbilt's capital, and literally used the giant's own immense wealth to fund the backroom bribery and mayhem that tore Vanderbilt's plans apart. He used the sheer mass of the enemy to crush the enemy.
We see an equally fascinating application of this in bureaucratic warfare. Let's examine the career of Colonel John Boyd in the United States Air Force during the late 1960s.
So Boyd was brought into the Pentagon to help reform how the military developed jet fighters, right?
Yeah, he was. But he immediately realized that the Pentagon wasn't a sleek military machine. It was a bloated, reactionary bureaucracy that cared more about commercial defense contracts than actually building good aircraft. It was a massive, entrenched system that fiercely resisted any kind of reform.
Now, if Boyd were an orthodox fighter, he would have written a blistering, comprehensive report, marched into a general's office, and demanded structural changes.
He would have launched a frontal assault on the status quo.
But Boyd was too smart for that. He knew that if he attacked the bureaucracy head-on, the system would simply identify him as a threat, isolate him, strip him of his influence, and quietly shuffle him out of the building.
The immune system would reject him.
Exactly. So he fought a bureaucratic guerrilla war. Instead of going through official channels, he formed these tight-knit, completely undetected cells. He quietly recruited young, frustrated engineers and staff members who shared his vision for reform. But let me play devil's advocate here. The Pentagon is one of the most rigidly structured, heavily monitored organizations on Earth. How does a handful of young staffers having quiet coffee meetings actually threaten a bureaucracy of that size? Why could the leadership just root them out and fire them?
Because the sheer size and structure of the bureaucracy is exactly what blinded it.
Okay, explain that.
Massive organizations are only capable of processing information and responding to threats in highly orthodox, conventional ways. They understand official memos, scheduled committee meetings, and rigid chains of command.
They only see what's on the org chart.
Precisely. When faced with a decentralized, fluid self-structure that operates purely through informal hallway conversations, shared ideology, and off-the-record meetings, the bureaucracy lacks the sensory organs to even perceive the threat. They have nothing tangible to counter. You cannot fire movement if you can't clearly identify who is in it or where it operates.
So Boyd used these invisible cells to gather intelligence. His network would find out what the reactionary generals were planning before the official memos were even typed. He could anticipate their roadblocks and quietly maneuver his reformist ideas into policy, completely under the radar. The giant never even knew it was being dismantled from the inside.
And this same fluidity applies to political strategy as well. If we look at Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s, we can analyze his tactical approach to fighting entrenched political power.
And just to be incredibly clear here to you listening, we are analyzing FDR's mechanical strategy strictly as it's laid out in the source document. We aren't taking a political stance on his policies left, right, or center. We are impartially looking at the mechanics of his strategy.
Completely neutral analysis of his tactics. What's fascinating about FDR's approach wasn't just his policy goals, but the mechanics of how he operated as a political guerrilla warrior against large, well-funded opposition.
Right. FDR knew his opponents. The established moneyed interests and conservative power brokers were massive, slow-moving targets used to conventional political slugfests. So he refused to give them a static target.
He changed the battlefield.
He leveraged a relatively new technology, the radio, to bypass traditional power structures entirely. Through his fireside chats, he projected a presence that felt intimate yet omnipresent. He seemed to be everywhere at once, waging a highly fleeted people's war that bypassed the editorial gatekeepers of the era.
Furthermore, he tactically reorganized the Democratic Party structure. Instead of allowing it to function as a lumbering, centralized political army that could be easily targeted, he encouraged it to operate as a network of mobile, fluid, local cells.
Keep moving, stay decentralized.
By keeping his political machinery decentralized and his own messaging constantly shifting, he kept his opponents perpetually off balance, fighting shadows instead of a fixed political front.
And perhaps the most surprising and frankly ironic arena where this strategy dominates is in personal relationships and romance.
Yes, the ultimate irony.
Think about Napoleon Bonaparte again. The man who conquered Europe but was destroyed by the void of Russia was actually conquered by the exact same strategy in his own home. Empress Josephine utilized a psychological tactic we might call guerrilla seduction.
To understand why it worked, you have to return to Tsar Alexander's profile of Napoleon. Napoleon was a conqueror. He was deeply aggressive and craved domination.
He had to win.
Josephine intuitively understood this psychological need. If she simply surrendered to him, he would quickly grow bored and discard her. If she fought him directly, his overwhelming personality would crush her.
So she played the mosquito.
She did.
She offered him tantalizing lures, hinting at affection and submission, but the moment he reached out to grasp her, she became evasive. She retreated emotionally. She created a void.
She used nothingness as a weapon.
She forced him to chase her, but gave his aggressive mind absolutely nothing solid to dominate. By perpetually denying him the finality of conquest he so desperately craved, she short-circuited his strategic brain. It drove him absolutely crazy, effectively enslaving the most powerful man in the world to her emotional whims.
Whether we are analyzing Jay Gould manipulating the financial markets, John Boyd hacking the Pentagon, FDR outmaneuvering political rivals, or Josephine seducing an emperor, the underlying mechanics are identical.
They all play by the Shadow Rulebook.
To execute the strategy of the void, you must master the manipulation of two specific dimensions, time and space.
Let's break those mechanics down, starting with time. In the Orthodox rulebook, time is your worst enemy.
Always.
Conventional armies and massive corporations want things done quickly because they are terrified of Murphy's Law. You know, the undeniable reality that over a long enough timeline, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Supply chains break, scandals erupt, morale plummets.
Therefore, the guerrilla fighter weaponizes Murphy's Law by deliberately extending time. By refusing to engage and dragging the conflict out over years, The elusive fighter ensures that Murphy's Law relentlessly degrades the larger opponent.
It's like gravity.
As the timeline stretches, unexpected friction destroys the giant's efficiency. The costs multiply exponentially, while the guerrilla's costs remain minimal.
But there's a brilliant, devious trap built into this manipulation of time. Because if you just endlessly retreat and offer absolutely no resistance, a smart opponent will eventually realize they are hitting empty air, cut their losses, and leave.
Right, they'll pack up and go home.
To keep the giant engaged over a long timeline, you have to use the illusion of success.
You have to feed their hope.
Exactly. You actually let the enemy take key positions. You surrender a hill. You let them win a minor procedural lawsuit. You allow them to pass a watered-down piece of legislation. You give them a tangible victory so they feel like they are making progress, that total dominance is just around the corner.
The carrot on the stick.
They will dig in and hold on to that new position tenaciously, convincing themselves the expense is worth it. And while they are bogged down defending that meaningless victory, you slowly ramp up the pinprick attacks from the shadows. You drain their resources. You use their own hope as the bait to keep them trapped in the void until they deteriorate.
That is how you manipulate time. The second dimension is space. A conventional fighter views the conflict strictly within the boundaries of the physical battlefield or the specific corporate market. The guerrilla fighter deliberately expands the space of the conflict outside that immediate theater.
You take the war to places the giant isn't prepared to fight. You move the conflict into the realm of public perception, international opinion, or moral debate.
Mechanically, the guerrilla aligns their struggle with a broader just cause. By doing so, they achieve something devastating. They isolate the larger enemy morally and politically on a global scale.
They become the underdog fighting the villain.
The giant may have overwhelming physical force, but by expanding the space of the conflict, the guerrilla frames the giant as a clumsy, unjustified bully. The giant's physical strength becomes a political liability.
So we've dragged out time, we expanded the space of the conflict, we're biting like a mosquito. How does this actually end? What is the end game of the void?
Well, there are two distinct paths to victory. Option A is the ideal scenario. The enemy simply dies of internal exhaustion and walks away.
The giant gives up.
This is the Napoleon outcome. The massive opponent realizes the cost of swatting the mosquito has vastly exceeded the value of the room. It is the preferred method because it costs the guerrilla very little, and it destroys the enemy's internal morale, as they have essentially defeated themselves.
But there is an option B, because time is a double-edged sword. You can't hide in the mountains or operate in the shadows forever. Eventually, the friction of time starts to wear down the guerrilla force as well.
Yes.
If the protraction becomes too costly, the evasive force must abandon the void, shift to conventional tactics, and deliver a final aggressive blow.
A prime historical example of option B is the Tet Offensive in 1968 during the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had successfully waged a protracted guerrilla war for years, stretching U.S. resources and political will.
But it was costing them heavily, too.
The toll on their own population was staggering. They realized they needed to break the stalemate, so they temporarily abandoned the strategy of the void and launched a massive, coordinated, conventional-style assault across dozens of cities simultaneously.
Going all in.
The goal was to aggressively accelerate the psychological deterioration of the U.S. war effort and shatter the illusion that a conventional victory was possible, forcing an end to the protraction.
Okay, as fascinating as it is to imagine being the master on mosquito manipulating the giant, we have to look at the other side of the board.
The defense.
What happens if you, the listener, realize you are the giant? What if you are currently dealing with an evasive, gaslighting, void-like opponent in your own career, or a bureaucratic nightmare that refuses to give you a straight answer? How do you fight the void?
This is the critical reversal. The very first thing you must understand is the absolute worst mistake you can make.
Which is?
Trying to solve the problem with conventional methods. If you start swinging your fists wildly at the mosquito, if you send angry, demanding emails, if you try to force a formal confrontation, you are playing directly into their strategy. You are giving them the energetic reaction they require to sustain the game.
You are providing the friction they desperately want. So what is the specific tactical error people make when they get frustrated?
The ultimate strategic mistake against a guerrilla force is responding in a graduated manner.
Meaning what, practically?
It means stepping up your effort incrementally. You encounter resistance, so you say, I'll try just a little bit harder. You allocate a slightly bigger budget to the failing project, or you escalate an argument one step further, and then you pause to see if that solved it.
Ah, I see.
This was the tragic flaw of the United States in Vietnam gradual escalation. A graduated response is fatal because it feeds the guerrilla exactly what they need, a protracted timeline. You are essentially drip-feeding them your energy and resources, allowing them to adapt to each small increase without ever overwhelming them.
So how do you actually counter it? If you can't step it up slowly, what do?
You must reverse their reversal. Their entire strategy relies on having infinite time to drain you and infinite space to evade you. You must aggressively deny them both. You cannot let them expand the argument or the theater of war. You must isolate them immediately, physically, politically, or administratively.
You have to corner the mosquito. You don't swat blindly. You find the swamp breeding them, and you drain it instantly, all at once, with overwhelming, decisive finality. You secure a quick victory, or you don't engage at all.
Exactly. But this leads us to the ultimate and undoubtedly the most difficult truth of countering the strategy of the void.
And this is the part that requires complete ego death.
It does. If you assess the situation and you realize that a quick, decisive, isolating victory is impossible, it is vastly better to immediately cut your losses, pull out, and walk away.
If you realize you are in a swamp and you can't drain it, you have to leave the swamp.
Yes.
Do not let your pride convince you to stay and fight a phantom. Do not let the sunk cost fallacy drag you into a 10-year war of attrition over a meaningless prize. Napoleon's ego wouldn't let him leave Moscow until the winter had already sealed his fate. Don't be Napoleon. Just walk away.
It is arguably the hardest thing for a powerful entity or an aggressive personality to do to retreat without achieving victory. But when faced with a true master of the void, early retreat is the only strategic maneuver that preserves your resources, your reputation, and your sanity.
So what does this all mean? The strategy of the void forces us to recognize a profound shift in how power actually operates. We are taught that conventional power size, massive wealth, direct aggression, the big stick, is the ultimate arbiter of success. But we've seen today that all of those advantages are completely neutralized by fluidity, emptiness, and the psychological weaponization of time.
The historical footprint is undeniable. We see a Napoleon freezing in the Russian snow because his mind demanded a battle that never came. We see corporate titans like Vanderbilt bleeding capital because they couldn't punch an invisible financial network.
Right.
We see inflexible bureaucracies dismantled from the inside out by fluid cells they couldn't even perceive. In every instance, the elusive side, the side that embraces the void, controls the dynamic.
It is entirely about denying your opponent a target and letting their own massive, clumsy frustration become the weapon that destroys them. But before we wrap this up, I want to toss this back to you for one final thought. Based purely on what our analysis says about human nature, our deep-seated inability to endure the void, our biological hatred of silence and inactivity, what should the listener take away from this for their own life?
I would urge you to deeply consider your own daily routines in the context of our modern hyper-accelerated world. The core mechanic of guerrilla power relies entirely on an opponent's inability to handle silence, inactivity, and a lack of constant contact. Now, observe how we live today. We experience visceral frustration if a text message is delayed by 2 minutes. We feel panic when we look at an empty afternoon on our schedule. We literally cannot handle a 60-second wait in a grocery checkout line without pulling out a screen for digital stimulation.
We hate the empty space.
This raises a profound and troubling question. If the strategy of the void preys on impatience and the desperate compulsive need for constant interaction, are we, by conditioning our brains to require unending digital friction, unknowingly turning our own minds into the perfect, highly impatient targets for this exact kind of manipulation?
That is an incredibly unsettling thought. We are basically training ourselves to be Napoleon in Moscow every time the Wi-Fi goes down.
Exactly.
If we can't handle 10 minutes of silence in an empty room, how on earth could we defend against an opponent or a system that deliberately weaponizes that silence against us? It really makes you want to look closely at the mosquitoes buzzing around your own life and perhaps realize that the most powerful strategic move you can make today is simply practicing how to sit quietly with the void. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, watch your blind spots, and beware the void.